start with an intro from the Vienna Principles. So in the Vienna Principles, there is a quote: "The production of knowledge serves mankind and increase prosperity. Free and open dissemination of knowledge with the scientific community and beyond facilitates exchange, collaboration, and the application of research result. There should be no technical, financial, or legal obstacles delaying or preventing the accessibility of research findings. All research results should be accessible to people that are diverse in physical, economic, or other conditions. Access should be ensured in long term." Is accessibility predominantly an issue of economic exclusion? What other areas of accessibility need to be considered? So this is the overall question in this second roundtable, and I will like to start with the question: is accessibility realistic in an increasing competitive academic world where researchers and institutions are competing for reputations and funding? So maybe I'll start this time with Stefan. What do you think?
Yeah, first of all, let me say a couple of words to the Vienna Principles. They were written from a group which is mainly publicly funded, as it is in Europe. Most of the universities and research infrastructures are publicly funded institutions, and I think this has something to do with my answer, because accessibility is realistic, because we shouldn't forget that most of the universities and infrastructures, research programs and projects in Europe are publicly funded, and therefore I think we easily can add as a main pillar for all future research activities. A very high degree of accessibility, and it brings me to something which is omnipresent at the moment in all discussions around open science, and also especially the European Open Science Cloud developments, is the principle of fair data. And as soon as you, as a scientist and as a research institution, as soon as you start to live the FAIR principles, you will also have the opportunity to easily bring all your data sets and your experimental results to a very high degree of accessibility for others. So I think this is the main issue about accessibility.
Thank you, Stefan. You mentioned the FAIR principles, and there is the accessibility in the FAIR principles is not automatically mean open. So these are two different things. Mm-hmm. What do you think about the difference between open and accessibility from the perspective of open knowledge, Lily?
Maybe the term open in open science is simply misleading, because what open is defined by the scientific community itself, and I think this is very good explanation, because the FAIR principles, you can have fair data sets from zero fair to 100% fair, yeah? And there's something in between, and it strongly depends on what kind of data sets do I have, and what do I want to get in a accessible manner, yeah? What kind of digital object is it? What I'm talking about. So to come back to the term open, the open is defined by the community itself, and I think this is also an important point when it comes to open science, because this implies a very high degree of freedom for the researchers to decide on their own what data sets are going out to the world, what data sets are being presented to the whole community. And I think this is a very important issue, because on the other hand, when you strictly allow every produced data set to be open, to be real open for everybody, accessible, this would then lead into a counter reaction from the scientists, I would suppose, because not every scientist wants to present the data sets immediately after they were produced, for example, or at a certain certain phase of the value chain of a data set. Yeah, you can also see it from this point of view. So the open and the definition of open is, I guess, the main or most important issue in the discussion here.
Thank you. So the kind of openness, or what exactly mean by open, or how open is defined by the community, or should defined by the community. So when we now look at the community of open knowledge, how do you define the openness, Lily?
Yeah, great question. So we really have a very liberal view of openness, where, ideally everything would be free for reuse and, creating new content from that with no restrictions. However, in many cases, that's not totally realistic. There need to be some protections, for instance, with patient data. But I want to go back and talk about FAIR, and how I think that FAIR is a great starting point, but I don't think that it is going to solve all of our problems. And I think that one thing that FAIR doesn't really touch on that's very important is licensing. And that licensing is very important for researchers to understand, and researchers don't understand it very well, but we need to know which licenses we're using when we publish data and other content as well. And, researchers aren't lawyers, but many organizations that researchers work for have lawyers, and they're there to protect the intellectual property. And then we get into the conversation of whose intellectual property is research content. Is it the funders in the US? That's mostly government funding for researchers. Or is it the organization where the researchers work? Or is it the researcher? Or is it maybe the public? And so I think that there's a lot of interesting conversations to be had about licensing and what the proper thing is to do when you are releasing data or other research materials.
Thank you. Yes, I think licensing is a very important issue, and I see it also from my daily work that's not easy, and also it's often a problem to see that somebody don't make it that open from the license perspective, because they are fearing that they get abused, or did it more commercialized in a way that they don't want to do it. So that's really a problem. How do you see the problem of licensing, Glenn?
So I'd like to just pick up on what Stefan was saying, because I'm afraid I disagree fundamentally. I think public money means public access, and public access should mean completely open. And there are two reasons for that. One is simply, if I'm paying for something as the public, I think I have a right to see that. And I don't think scientists should take my money if they're not prepared to let me see it. But I think there's another pragmatic reason why it's very dangerous to say, okay, I'll take your money, but I'm not going to let you see what my research produces, because it allows publishers to take essentially the same attitude that just because it's publicly funded doesn't mean that the public has a right to see something. And that's why Elsevier has a profit margin of 40%. They take things produced by publicly funded work, as we all know, and then publish it. I used to be a publisher. I know how much it costs to publish things. I can see that they make these huge profits because they do very little with things that belong to the public. So I think it's very dangerous not to insist that scientists make publicly funded work publicly available. If they don't like that, don't take my money.
Okay. So in your opinion, everybody should be also should everything from the research should be licensed open and put everything open, which is publicly funded.
Yes, with the proviso, pick up on Lily's point, that obviously if there is personal information, that should not be licensed. But that's not about openness, that's about data protection. And clearly you have a Venn diagram of materials, some of which are things that should be open, some things that should never be open, like DNA material. It would be crazy to publish people's DNA material. There are things in the middle that maybe are personal but don't really matter. So I would say that there are other factors like the GDPR in the EU that must be taken account of. But as a general principle, non-personal data should be freely and openly available.
Thank you, Glenn. And what do you think, Sabina, from your perspective about openness and accessibility? Do you see difference, or should everything get open?
So I would agree, of course, that it's important for researchers to make a commitment to openness, particularly researchers which are funded by public funding. Whether that means that all data need to be open, actually here I also fundamentally disagree. I think that there are serious questions around, I mean, in fact, what does it mean? What is the research that needs to be open? What is a research output? What makes sense as a meaningful component of research to share? Now, in many cases, data sets will be such a meaningful component, but I would argue only and exclusively if they're accompanied by proper metadata. So data that is just published without any information about its provenance is pretty much useless. And so this is an obvious case in which you have access to information, but you have really no means of making meaningful use of it. So you don't have a usable resource. So I think, comes back to some of the points we discussed in the previous panel. There needs to be a system that guarantees that not only we push some form of open data, but we push forms of open data that are actually usable. And the usable part, I think, is more important than the comprehensiveness of that information. I mean, and of course, this is also because, and in many communities I'm working with of the research, there are strong views about this. It's really not clear that absolutely everything that's ever coming out of a certain experimental setup is worth sharing. Right, so researchers they clean their data all the time. In fact, many people keep asserting that 80% of data work actually consists of data cleaning. And there are cases where data are interested before they're cleaned, because maybe they're cleaned for a particular purpose, and so you want to be able to reuse them for other purposes. But there are other situations where maybe some data set has been eliminated for very good reason, because the instrumentation that produced it was defective, right? So I think it's really impossible to eliminate the element of judgment by the experts who are actually producing some of these outputs in thinking about what makes sense as something that a broader community can reuse as a resource, and what in fact is just noise and it doesn't really contribute to the open science landscape. Building on that, I think there are questions around thinking about open science as just putting an avalanche of information out. I think that's an understanding of openness that's actually been used also for obfuscation, as some people have argued, relatively often. I mean, sometimes that's, I mean, arguably maybe that's something that's what happened with WikiLeaks, the fact that you make everything open and reveal everything, but in fact you still need expert intervention, for instance by journalists, in sifting through that material and speaking for that material, because the material doesn't really speak for himself. So I think, I mean, I'm very much on the side of thinking through openness and thinking about accessibility, but I think accessibility is really important, especially when we're thinking about what can be reused and and to which purpose is access put. And that will cash out very differently depending on which component of research we're looking at and which publish we're considering. Certainly when one thinks about open access, so the publication of papers, I think is a no contest and is a no-brainer. I mean, I'm very much following on what Glenn was saying about publishers making a profit. I think there is no argument that finished papers, which are, finished outputs, which have been thought through and peer-reviewed of research which has been made public, really should be made as widely accessible as possible. For other components of research, I think slightly more complex considerations apply with the same principle, but just thinking about, what other factors are involved in thinking about accessibility. Of course, there's a third leg to this, which is responsibility and what is responsible sharing, if you want. I'm not going to make a long intervention of this, but just to signal the fact that this goes well beyond thinking about personal information. So that's where the spotlight for these questions have been for a long time. I work on a big project now looking at responsibility in sharing plant data, so data that apply to crop and plant science research. And there's a lot of ethical questions around sharing some of that data in the absence of licensing systems that actually guarantee that the ownership of some of that knowledge is recognized, particularly, for instance, when it comes from indigenous communities. So in that sense, I would very much agree with the points that Lily were making, that a big part of making sure that data can be shared appropriately is making sure that we have a broader ecosystem around them and an understanding of the licensing system attached to them, so that is actually done responsibly and in a way that can be useful to others.
Thank you. That's very interesting point. So when you came to publication, I think it's very easily to say, okay, this is something which should really go open and this must go open. But when you go to the data, then it's more complex and there must be some kind of level how you generate the access. Is this right? So Glenn, can you agree with this argument or do you disagree?
Well, I of course agree that it is complex and it's not just as simplistic, you've got to do everything in the same way. I'm not convinced by the idea that we shouldn't release a torrent of data, because the whole point is you don't know how that might be used. Maybe the noise has something interesting. So when you start to pre-filter things, I think you run the risk of losing the information. So I wouldn't really agree with that. The one to do with indigenous communities, I agree, is more problematic, but I think that's part of a larger issue, which is all about the exploitation of information unfairly by essentially large companies. So I would rather address it through that rather than locking down information, which I think should be avoided as default. As I say, the personal data is clearly excluded. There are other issues to do with dangerous information. I mean, you can think of providing information about dangerous bacteria or dangerous viruses. So there are certainly questions around that. But so I agree to a certain extent, but not entirely.
Okay. Please, Lily.
Thanks. I just want to follow up there that I think that a very important aspect of the research life cycle that talks or deals with this is creating a research data management plan from the beginning and trying to think through these questions before you start doing an experiment. So data management plan helps you think of things like, what will the license be? What data are you releasing? What metadata do you need? And also importantly, where are you going to release this data and how are you going to pay for it? So talking about what Sabina was mentioning, I agree that I don't think that everything has to be released or, necessarily everything has to be released. And a large part of that is the practicalities. Where is that data going to be stored? Who's going to pay for it? Like I love Zenodo. Zenodo is a great place to store data. But who is paying for that in the long term? I mean, there is an answer to that, but 20, 50 years from now, where's that data going to be? So I think these are interesting questions that we need to think about before we release data.
Yeah, this is also a question of cost. It's really interesting, and who will pay. So it's also the question, and maybe this goes now back to Stefan. Is there also from the government side that, because if you have a data infrastructure which have to be keep up long term, there are also a lot of costs inside.
Yes, indeed. And when this brings me again to what I've said at the beginning. Maybe I was kind of misunderstood. I think in the whole, this is what Lily said in the whole process of your data gaining. You should be aware of the fact that you will at the end publish it, your results. At the end, you will open your data sets maybe for the rest of the world. But this is something you should keep in mind as soon as you are thinking about a project, a research project. And from the financial point of view, of course, it is important that publicly funded research is at the end open to the public. Yeah? But there are so many degrees of different levels of information in your data sets. I could not imagine that, for example, the high energy physics community has something against publishing the data, but it's only a handful of people in the world who's really able to deal with it. Yeah, and this is the same is for other data sets. But let me give you a good example where we never ever ask the question about the publicly funded or not, yeah, to open it, is DNA data. In the early 90s, when we started in the life science community to sequence, and the platforms were getting faster and faster, and then there was the first human genome was finally then published also in an open manner. There was the data bank was invited, and for the scientific community, this was just how shall I put it? This was just gold, because you whenever you on your own wanted to publish a DNA sequence, you have to put it into data bank, to GenBank, and on the other hand, all the other colleagues from all over the world did it as well. So you had an endless, and still have an endless source of published data sets, which are behind all these publications. So I think this is a very good example how it could work for other sectors as well. Yeah, and to come back to the problematic of the filters that we apply when we're doing research, we're having data sets, and thinking about to what extent do I publish my data sets to the public. I think this is a very important thing, because nobody has an advantage from data sets which are not in a way reusable. Yeah? So I think this is the crucial point, to get these data sets in a format that are reusable for the rest of the community, and then they have a very good value, I guess. Then you can reuse it, and then you need the access, and then you have no further problem with this. But from the cost point of view, again, all the production of these data sets, they are within projects, programs, and big efforts of the scientific community. So they are funded. Yeah. So the keeping and the managing of the data sets will be in near future an integrative part of the scientific work. As Lily said, the data management plans, they will apply, and they're doing so at the moment. And the funders for themselves, they will increasingly also include these data management plans into their funding proposals, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. Let's talk a little bit from the other side of the funding system. So there's also commercial funded research. Do you think it's possible, from the perspective of accessibility, from the commercial funded research that we can access them also. What do you think from Sabrina? Is this something what do you think there will be no change or no way to access them after the research process to reuse it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's a very important question. I think in the last 15 years or so, I've seen shifts in the ways in which big companies, especially, were discussing the potential for data sharing beyond their own silos. I think, for instance, about 10 years ago or so, there's been a moment within the pharma industry where there's been discussions across different players, pointing to the fact that, in fact, the public sector was outstripping the capacity of any single industry to curate their data properly so that they would be reusable in the best possible way and efficiently, and pushing the idea that in fact there should be more data sharing by industry and from their own R&D departments so that they could in fact take advantage of all the advances that have been made in the public sector around how to standardize data, how to format them, how to reuse them, and so on and so forth. Now, personally, I am a little bit skeptical as to the current outcome of these kinds of discussions. In fact, I've been disappointed not to see much broader commitment to data sharing in the biomedical realm. We've seen some of these, I suppose, currently within the pandemic research, but even now, at a moment where the whole world has pretty much come to a standstill and there is an absolute requirement to do research on these issues, there are still barriers posed by competition between different companies around who is going to get to the vaccine the fastest. So I think there is a very serious problem there, potentially an even more serious problem in other sectors. And here I'm thinking about the agricultural sector and agrotech, where really the vast majority of data that concern food security and research on crops is held in silos, to the point that publicly funded researchers don't even have a clue of what data actually are there. We don't know what research is in fact being performed. At least in the biomedical realm, because of the regulation that requires some oversight, we know which clinical trials are being undertaken because they need to be given clearance by government funding agencies, at least in some countries, while that's not the case for agricultural research. So I think ultimately I'm pretty pessimistic about the situation at the moment. It seems to me that the vast majority of data that in fact should be made accessible, at least information about which data there are, if not the data themselves, are actually being kept, being kept from any scrutiny.
So, Lily, do you think also in the same way that's very hard to give access to the commercial funded research results?
Yes, I have to agree with Sabina. The only other thing I have to add, because I think she did a great job explaining that, was that recently I was talking with a researcher who is looking at trying to get data from wearables like smartwatches. And he was telling me that the data, like each company has a different standard that they use to describe that data. And even within the company, different departments will use different standards to describe that data. And so he was able to access some of that data that has been openly released, but it was extremely difficult to try and integrate it from different wearables, from different brands and different companies. And I thought that was just a really interesting problem that I hadn't encountered I encounter it in academic research, but I hadn't encountered it in that commercial aspect as well.
Mm. Yes, I think the problem of standards is that they are not really standards. Glenn, what do you think about the commercial side of the funding?
So Sabina was describing the situation particularly with, say, the agricultural industries. And I think it's really a sad reflection on our society, the fact that we are impotent in the face of these companies generating enormous quantities of information about food and other products, which potentially could sort of solve the supply of food to the rest of the world, and they can just do that. And there is no legal framework that says that they shouldn't do that. So I realize this is a slightly longer term problem, but I think we need to get to the situation whereby we can actually demand that data from companies, because I think the world has a right to that, because people are starving from the lack of it.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good point. Stefan, what do you think about this situation? There's a lot of necessary data kept by companies, which are also done with help from publicly funded universities. Are there some possibilities for legal frameworks to get more access to this kind of data?
In principle, I guess it is possible to break this up via the funding conditions. Especially when I look at the European programs, there has been, let's say, centuries of funding for industry without having any clue, as Sabina said, any clue about what is in the, what are the keeping, what is their data sets consistent of. Let's say in the pharma industry or in agricultural industry. So I think it's the part is here rather important from the side of the funders, I guess. They have to insist on the fact that all the data which are produced within this commercially funded or publicly funded in public-private partnerships, for example, these are rather interesting projects. They should break this barrier because the industry itself also has an incentive, because they want to take part into this reopened ecosystem of digital objects. They want to take part in the European Open Science Cloud, for example. But on the other hand, they also have to do their job on their own and to be as open as the rest of the community, I guess.
Thank you, Stefan. We are now coming to our end. This will be the last round, and I will ask for a short statement. We have addressed the fair data principles and also archiving data, so it's for long-term perspective. What do you think is the archiving of data and the approach of fair data principles a good way to do this, or is a starting point, or is it something what's really the goal, and it's the good world that we must have, what we must do? Maybe Glenn, you would like to start?
So, I mean, as you probably guessed, I'm an open extremist, and I really think that openness should be the baseline, and you should have to justify why things aren't open rather than the other way around. Obviously, that's a pretty radical turning on the head of the current situation, but I think that's what we should be working towards, and scientists have an incredibly important role to play in that.
Thank you, Glenn. Yeah. Lily, what is your perspective on this?
Yeah, so there are things that I love about FAIR. I like it as a starting point. I think that it's super useful, especially for people that do not have any background in being open. I think it's a useful checklist, useful acronym. But I think that we can go a lot farther than FAIR. I think, I was saying this earlier, we need to have licensing thought of. We need to have other aspects that go beyond FAIR. So for reproducibility, we barely touch on the aspects that make something reproducible. So if you were going to go through that checklist and give something like a score for being fair, you could have two very different items have the same score of fairness, and they could have in actuality different levels of openness or different levels of accessibility. And so I think it's a great starting point. And I think it's a great place to start a conversation, but I think that there's a lot more work to be done.
Thank you, Lily. You, Sabina?
Yeah, thank you. So I agree with Lily. I mean, it's a great starting point. And I think what's particularly great about the FAIR principles is that they put the spotlight very firmly on the question of what makes data usable and what it takes in terms of infrastructures and in terms of skills. And these are very, very important things to be aware of, both by researchers and institutions and governments, because both training and skill building exercises and the building of long-term infrastructures are actually very expensive. And so that calls for investments in this area, and basically saying it's not enough to say that data need to be open. We really need to invest on making it possible for it to be open and to be usable when they're open. So I think that was a really good thing that the FAIR principles brought attention to. And of course, this is just a starting point, because all of those structures of those agreements, these forms of governance are being built and need to continue to be built. The other thing that I think the FAIR principles potentially started, but in fact didn't touch much upon, and I think that's something that we're trying now to do a lot of work, both with UNESCO, with United Nations, with the FAO and other international organizations, is the question of what it means to have responsible data sharing. This is something that the FAIR principles don't even mention, despite their name. And in fact, that creates some confusion, I think. But the question of what does it mean for data to be shared fairly is absolutely crucial. My research group is doing a lot of work on this, as thankfully are many other groups around the world. And I think this is going to be very, very important going forward, not just in terms of recognizing the work put by all sorts of different communities, which are not scientific communities, in the creation of data, which is of course important, but also in terms of thinking more carefully about what are the implications of research in general. I mean, thinking about research as something which people need to be responsible for is, I think, is a constant concern. This is not just about open science, it's about any form of research, and it's about all ages. But I think we're hopefully making some headway at this point in starting to train researchers to think about the potential implications of the work that they do. And I think this is particularly important when it comes to research design and things like data management plans and potential uses of the data and the different research components which we have in research.
Thank you, Sabine. I think training is a really essential aspect of this whole process. Stefan, please.
Yeah, I totally agree to what the previous speaker said. FAIR is a starting point, and to my opinion, it is a necessary starting point, because we are working at the moment, at least in Europe, and I think internationally seen as well, on something like the European Open Science Cloud, which also a misleading definition. I would rather name it the World Wide Web of fair data and services. And when we are facing to generate this World Wide Web, this new World Wide Web of fair data, this is a trust-building process. And I think trust is the main driving force to at the end come up with something real open. And I think this is the view at the moment.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you to all. It was a great second roundtable. Thank you for this great discussions in both roundtables. And I hope you also enjoyed it like me. And have a great day.